The courtroom hummed with a low, nervous energy that morning, a blend of whispers, shuffling papers, and the occasional cough that echoed against the high wooden walls. It was one of those days where the air itself seemed to weigh heavily, carrying with it the anticipation of something important. Reporters sat at the back, pens ready, eyes sharp, waiting for headlines to write. Jurors filed into their seats, each wearing a guarded expression, their lives temporarily put on hold to judge someone else's fate. Family members of both the accused and the victim clutched tissues or folded their hands tightly, as if bracing for impact. At the heart of it all sat the defendant, a man in his early 30s, dressed in a borrowed suit that fit him only loosely. His hands fidgeted beneath the table, his jaw clenched, and his eyes remained fixed on a single scuff mark in the polished floor. To some in the room, he was already guilty, a criminal caught red-handed thanks to the flawless nose of a police K-9. To others, he was a man being swallowed by a justice system that didn't always get it right. But in this moment, no verdict had yet been declared, and the weight of possibility lingered. The case itself seemed straightforward on the surface. A burglary had rattled a suburban neighborhood known more for its quiet cul-de-sacs and weekend barbecues than for crime scenes. A home had been broken into late at night, valuables stolen, and the family left shaken but unharmed. Neighbors had called the police immediately after spotting a suspicious figure darting across lawns, and officers had arrived swiftly with a K-9 unit. The dog had sniffed the trail, following it past several streets until it ended at the doorstep of the defendant's home. For investigators, it felt like a triumph of training, a textbook example of canine skill and police diligence. Now, the prosecution was eager to highlight that triumph. As the lead prosecutor organized her files, she exuded an air of confidence, her shoulders squared and her eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. She had built her case on the reliability of the K-9 unit, emphasizing that dogs trained for law enforcement rarely made mistakes. This animal, she planned to tell the jury, isn't just man's best friend, it's justice's best ally. Across the aisle, the defense team was quieter but no less determined. They understood the power of perception. Jurors tended to trust dogs implicitly. The challenge wasn't just to create doubt. It was to fight against the emotional weight of believing in a loyal, infallible companion. For weeks, the defense had combed through reports, searching for cracks, hoping to uncover inconsistencies that could shift the narrative. Yet even as they prepared, a lingering sense of uphill battle pressed against them. How does one argue against the nose of a dog? The judge, a man seasoned by decades of presiding over cases both sensational and mundane, entered the room with his usual calm authority. His black robe flowed as he took his seat, scanning the courtroom with an expression that balanced neutrality with quiet firmness. He was known for his patience, but also for his refusal to entertain theatrics. Justice, in his eyes, was a matter of clarity, not drama. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his gavel once, and the murmur of the courtroom faded into silence. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, his voice booming. The room stood, then sat again as the proceedings began. The prosecutor delivered her opening statement with practiced precision. She painted a picture of the burglary, the family's fear, the quick police response, and the heroic K-9 who had led officers straight to the accused. She emphasized reliability, training, and science, weaving a story that left little room for doubt. The jurors nodded along, their expressions serious, their pens scribbling occasional notes. When it was the defense's turn, the tone shifted. The defense attorney, a man with silver at his temples and a measured voice, urged the jury to look past appearances. "What seems simple," he said, "is not always what is true. Evidence, even evidence that appears strong, can be flawed." He reminded them of their duty, to weigh the facts carefully, not to be swayed by assumptions or emotion. Though his words were steady, the challenge ahead was clear. The canine's testimony silent, though it was hung like a shadow over his arguments. Meanwhile, the spectators watched with rapt attention. Every gesture, every phrase seemed amplified in the quiet room. The defendant's mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, while the victim's relatives leaned forward, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and grief. Reporters noted every word, already imagining the headlines they would type later. Canine hero helps crack case, or burglary trial hinges on canine testimony. Atmosphere was a delicate balance of formality and tension. On the surface, it was just another trial, one of hundreds the courthouse would see in a year. But for those inside, it was far more. It was a battle over truth, reputation, and freedom. It was a story that felt like it had already been written, with the K9 cast as the unshakable star. Yet beneath the surface, the story was not as complete as it seemed. As witnesses began to be called, the foundation of the prosecution's case grew clearer. The police officers described the night in detail, the frantic calls from neighbors, the swift arrival, the unleashing of the dog. They spoke of how the K9 lowered its nose, sniffed the air, and tracked with unerring focus. "We trusted him," one officer said with conviction, "and he led us right to the suspect." The words carried weight, and jurors leaned in, absorbing them as if they were fact carved in stone. The K9's presence in the courthouse was scheduled for later, during a demonstration, but already its role loomed large. Even the way people spoke of the animal carried reverence, as if it were more than just a dog. It was a symbol of truth. For the prosecution, it was a powerful tool. For the defense, it was a mountain to climb. And so the first day of trial unfolded, each side staking its claim, the tension thickening with every exchange. Outside, the world went on as normal cars honked, phones rang, children walked home from school. But inside the courtroom, time felt slower, heavier. Each sentence seemed to echo louder than it should. Each look between attorneys carried unspoken strategies, and each shift of the jurors' eyes hinted at opinions being quietly formed. The case had only just begun, yet already it felt like a storm gathering. And like any storm, no one could fully predict where it would break, or who would be left standing when the clouds finally cleared. What no one realized, as the first day closed and people gathered their belongings, was that the trial's turning point would not come from a lawyer's strategy or an officer's testimony. It would not come from the carefully trained K9, nor from the defendant's pleas of innocence. Instead, it would come from a source so unlikely, so unassuming, that the entire courtroom would gasp in disbelief when it happened. For now, though, the players took their places, the lines were drawn, and the story unfolded one tense, deliberate step at a time. The second morning of the trial dawned with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the city. Rain tapped against the tall courthouse windows, blurring the view of bustling streets below. Inside, though, the courtroom was its own world, sealed off from the noise of traffic and the rush of daily life. Every person who entered carried their own reason for being there, some to testify, some to observe, some to fight for justice. Amid the polished shoes, pressed suits, and quiet murmurs of lawyers and jurors, a figure slipped in that few noticed at first. It was a young mother, her hair pulled into a hurried bun, a diaper bag slung over one shoulder. In her arms wriggled a toddler, wide-eyed, restless, and far too young to understand the solemnity of the place she had just entered. They settled into the spectator benches quietly, the mother lowering herself with the air of someone who didn't want to draw attention. To most in the courtroom, she was just another face, another relative of someone connected to the trial. But her child would soon prove to be anything but ordinary in this unfolding drama. The toddler's arrival was out of place in more ways than one. Courtrooms were designed for adults, wooden benches that forced straight posture, long speeches peppered with legal jargon, and hours of structured silence. A child's presence, especially one barely past the age of learning her first words, was almost jarring. Yet she sat there, perched on her mother's lap, with a curiosity that seemed boundless. Her big, round eyes darted from the judge to the attorneys, then to the jury, then to the defendant sitting stiffly at his table. Where adults saw stress and procedure, she saw only a room full of strange people and new things. Her small hands fidgeted with a toy. Her mother had slipped from the bag something soft and colorful meant to keep her quiet. But even as she clutched it, her gaze wandered. She pointed once toward the ceiling, whispering, "Light." Her mother hushed her gently, embarrassed by the sound that carried farther than intended. A few jurors smiled faintly, amused by the innocent intrusion into the otherwise stiff atmosphere. The bailiff shot a disapproving glance, but said nothing. After all, it wasn't uncommon for families to bring young children when no one else was available to watch them. Still, there was something striking about the little girl's attentiveness. Most toddlers would have grown bored and cranky within minutes, but she seemed fascinated, as though the trial were a story being played out for her amusement. Her head tilted at the rhythm of voices, her eyes brightened when someone raised their tone, and she giggled once when a chair scraped too loudly against the floor. Her mother's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, though the laughter was short-lived. Around them, the trial pressed on. The prosecutor reviewed more details about the burglary, the stolen jewelry, the damage to the home, the fear that lingered in the family afterward. Jurors nodded somberly, their pens scratching across notepads. The defendant's shoulders sagged, his lips tight as his lawyer whispered encouragement in his ear. To the adults, it was a battle of credibility. To the toddler, it was simply a room full of energy and voices to absorb. At one point, the child squirmed free enough to stand on her mother's lap. She pointed at the jurors, her tiny voice carrying a single word, "People." A ripple of restrained chuckles moved through the gallery before the judge tapped his gavel once to restore order. The mother mouthed an apology, bouncing her daughter lightly in an effort to keep her distracted. But no amount of shushing could dim the child's curiosity. What no one realized in that moment was just how important that curiosity would become. It was as if the toddler sensed the tension in the air, picking up on emotions more than facts. While the lawyers measured their words and the judge weighed his patience, the little girl had no such restraints. To her, there was no filter between observation and expression. She saw, she spoke, she pointed pure, unedited truth. As the proceedings wore on, the young mother occasionally caught the defendant glancing their way. She knew him distantly, though not enough to be fully involved in the case. Her presence there was partly familial obligation, partly moral support. But she couldn't have known that bringing her daughter along would shift the trial's trajectory. All she wanted was to sit quietly, offer comfort through her presence, and leave unnoticed. The toddler, however, had other plans. She clapped once when a lawyer raised his voice too forcefully. She whispered, "Doggy?" When someone mentioned the canine that had been used in the investigation, though the animal wasn't in the room yet. Her mother pressed a hand over her mouth, mortified. Still, the child's timing was uncanny, her words slipping into the air just as key details were spoken aloud. A few jurors even glanced her way with bemused expressions, as though momentarily pulled out of their seriousness by her innocent interruptions. By the time the morning session drew to a close, the toddler had become an unnoticed participant in the trial, though no one yet realized it. She was background noise, a distraction, perhaps even a nuisance, but in truth, she was absorbing everything around her in the way only children could. Her eyes locked onto faces, her memory stored details, and her voice, though small, carried enough to cut through the courtroom's tension whenever she chose to speak. As the recess was called, the mother gathered her things hurriedly, trying to slip out before anyone complained about her child's behavior. But even as they left, the toddler craned her neck back toward the front of the courtroom, eyes lingering on the door where the canine would eventually appear. She recognized something already, though she had no words to explain it. The trial had begun as a straightforward battle of evidence and argument, but the unexpected presence of a child had added a ripple of unpredictability. The jurors didn't know it. The attorneys didn't know it. The judge certainly didn't know it. But the story was no longer only about the defendant, the burglary, or even the police dog. It was about the eyes of a toddler who saw what others had overlooked, and the voice that, in time, would break the courtroom's fragile order with a revelation no one could ignore. For now, though, the mother simply tightened her grip on her daughter's hand and walked her out into the hallway, unaware of the storm her child was destined to unleash. The third day of the trial opened with an air of anticipation, unlike the days before. Reporters had arrived early, cameras flashing outside as the courthouse steps filled with onlookers, curious about the case that was quickly gaining local attention. Inside the courtroom, whispers floated like static before proceedings began. Everyone knew this was the day the police canine, the animal whose nose had supposedly cracked the case, would be brought in for a demonstration. For the prosecution, this moment was designed to be theatrical. The lead prosecutor had built much of her case around the dog's performance, emphasizing again and again that its instincts and training had led officers directly to the accused. To her, the canine wasn't just an animal, it was a living embodiment of justice, a witness who couldn't lie, whose senses were sharper than any human's. And she knew the jury would feel the same. Who could look at a well-trained, loyal dog and doubt its integrity? The defense team, meanwhile, wore looks of restrained skepticism. They had prepared as best they could, but the truth was simple. Jurors trusted dogs. Dogs weren't biased, dogs weren't political, and dogs weren't supposed to be wrong. Discrediting the canine without looking desperate or callous would be a delicate balance. Their client's life hinged on the possibility of creating doubt in the very evidence most people instinctively believed. The defendant sat quietly at the table, eyes lowered, as though bracing himself for another blow. He knew what the canine meant to the case. He knew that once the animal entered, the jurors' confidence in his guilt would only harden. He pressed his hands together, knuckles white, and whispered something to his attorney that no one else could hear. Then the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The judge entered, calm and deliberate as always, and after the usual formalities, the prosecutor rose from her seat with a controlled smile. "Your Honor," she began, "the state would like to call Officer Daniels and his partner, Coda, to the stand." The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. In stepped Officer Daniels, tall and broad-shouldered, in full uniform. At his side trotted a German shepherd with a gleaming coat and intelligent eyes that scanned the room with quiet authority. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even those who had been skeptical sat up straighter. The dog Coda moved with precision, every step measured, every glance alert. His ears flicked, his nose twitched as if cataloging scents that no one else could detect. The chain at his collar clinked softly as he sat obediently at his handler's side, tail brushing the polished floor. It was an entrance designed to impress, and it succeeded. Jurors leaned forward almost unconsciously, smiles tugging at the corners of their mouths. One woman in the front row folded her hands beneath her chin, her expression softening. The canine wasn't just a witness now, he was a presence, commanding the room in a way few humans could. Even the judge, who prided himself on neutrality, couldn't hide a faint trace of admiration. Officer Daniels took the oath and began his testimony, describing Coda's training with practiced ease. He spoke of scent trails, obedience drills, and real-world operations where the dog's work had led to successful arrests. "He's been with the department for 5 years," Daniels said proudly. Highly decorated, with a flawless record, every word reinforced the dog's reliability. Then came the recounting of the night in question. Daniels described the scene in detail, arriving at the neighborhood, releasing Coda to sniff for a trail, and following as the dog moved with unwavering focus. "He led us straight to the residence of the defendant," Daniels declared firmly. There was no hesitation, no confusion. He made the identification. The words hung in the air like iron. Jurors scribbled notes, nodding. The prosecutor allowed herself a glance toward the defense table, confident the weight of the testimony had landed. But amid the solemnity, one small pair of eyes watched differently. The toddler, seated once again in her mother's lap, had grown unusually still. From the moment Coda entered the courtroom, her gaze had locked onto him, unblinking. Her tiny fingers gripped her mother's blouse as she whispered, "Doggy?" Her voice was quiet, almost reverent, but filled with recognition. Her mother pressed a finger to her lips, shushing gently. "Yes, honey, doggy." Quiet now, but the toddler's fascination didn't fade. She leaned forward, her eyes tracking every movement of the German shepherd as if she'd seen him before. To her, this wasn't a stranger, it was familiar. Meanwhile, the demonstration began. Officer Daniels led Coda around the courtroom, explaining commands and showcasing obedience. The dog sat, stood, barked on command, all with precision that drew murmurs of admiration. At one point, Daniels produced a cloth used during training and instructed Coda to locate it. The dog moved swiftly, nose to the ground, before stopping at the defense table, pawing gently at the cloth placed nearby for the exercise. The jurors were impressed. The prosecutor smiled broadly. To them, the demonstration was proof of everything the state had argued. This dog was trustworthy, precise, and without bias. But then, just as Daniels was about to lead Coda back to his seat, the toddler's voice rang out, clear and unrestrained. "Doggy, he came to our house." The words cut through the courtroom like a crack of thunder. Gasps erupted instantly. The mother froze, her face flushing crimson as she tried to cover her daughter's mouth. The judge slammed his gavel down, demanding order, but the shock had already rippled across the room. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, some leaning back in disbelief. The defense attorney's head snapped up, eyes sharp with sudden interest. The prosecutor's face drained of color. Even Officer Daniels faltered, gripping Coda's leash more tightly as murmurs swelled in the gallery. The toddler, unfazed by the sudden tension, repeated with innocent certainty, "Doggy was at our house." "Doggy came?" She clapped her hands once, delighted at her own announcement, before her mother buried her face in her shoulder in mortification. For a moment, silence hung thick, broken only by the dog's calm panting. And in that silence, the certainty of the prosecution's case cracked for the very first time. The K9, once a symbol of unshakable truth, had just been tied to a revelation no one had expected, a revelation that would shift the trial in ways no attorney, no officer, and no juror could have foreseen. The child had recognized him, and in that recognition, the story of the case began to unravel. The words left the toddler's mouth with a clarity that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Doggy, he came to our house." For a fraction of a second, the courtroom froze in stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, stretching impossibly long, where every tick of the old wall clock seemed like a hammer against steel. Jurors blinked in disbelief. Attorneys froze mid-note. The defendant lifted his head, eyes widening as though he'd just heard the faintest suggestion of salvation. And then, as if the air itself had been broken, the room erupted into chaos. Gasps swirled across the gallery. Murmurs rose and collided, until the judge slammed his gavel down, demanding order. Silence. This court will have order. His voice boomed, but even his authority struggled against the waves of disbelief now rippling through the chamber. The mother, mortified, tried to hush her daughter. She pressed the child against her chest, whispering urgently, "Quiet, sweetheart, please." But the toddler, delighted by the sudden attention, wriggled free just enough to clap her hands once and repeat, in that clear, unfiltered voice, "Doggy came to our house." Doggy was there. Her words weren't confused or hesitant. They carried the innocent certainty of a memory, untainted by doubt. She pointed again at the German shepherd, her finger steady, her eyes wide with recognition. The dog, unaware of the storm he had unleashed, sat calmly beside his handler, tongue lolling slightly, as though the courtroom drama had nothing to do with him. The prosecutor's face went pale. She rose from her chair quickly, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The remarks of a toddler should not be considered relevant to these proceedings." Her voice wavered, betraying the confidence she had worn only minutes earlier. The defense attorney, however, leaned forward like a man who had just been handed a lifeline. "On the contrary, Your Honor," he countered, voice steady but charged with energy. "The child has recognized the very canine presented as the linchpin of the state's case. This cannot be dismissed without examination." The judge, gavel still in hand, studied the mother and child with a stern gaze. He had presided over countless cases, seen theatrics of every variety, but never had a toddler interrupted proceedings with words that struck directly at the heart of the evidence. Slowly, he exhaled. "This court will take a brief recess. Bailiff, escort the witness and her child to a separate room for questioning." The word witness seemed strange when applied to someone barely able to form sentences. Yet the judge's choice was deliberate. The child had spoken, and what she said mattered, at least enough to shake the courtroom. As the mother was led out, her face flushed with embarrassment, she whispered apologies to anyone who would listen. "She doesn't understand. She just says things sometimes." But the defense attorney followed with quick steps, determination in his eyes. He knew children that age didn't fabricate with such conviction. If the toddler recognized the dog, it meant one critical truth. Coda had been at their house before the night of the burglary. And if that were true, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, an unbroken scent trail, was already compromised. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed like static after a lightning strike. Jurors whispered furiously among themselves. Some wore skepticism, others worry, but none looked as certain as they had moments ago. The defendant sat straighter, his pulse pounding as hope flickered for the first time since the trial began. Officer Daniels, the handler, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His grip on Coda's leash tightened. He knew his dog's reliability better than anyone. But he also knew the truth. Coda had been in that neighborhood days before, responding to a separate call. He hadn't thought it mattered. A report had been filed, forgotten in the mountain of routine paperwork. But now, thanks to a toddler's words, that detail had burst into the open. The recess stretched long, though in reality it was less than 20 minutes. When the judge returned, his expression was stern, unreadable. He tapped his gavel once. "This court acknowledges that the child's statement raises questions regarding the canine's prior presence in the neighborhood. Counsel for both sides will be permitted to address this matter." The prosecutor leapt to her feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we cannot allow the unverified recollections of a toddler to undermine the credibility of trained law enforcement." Her words came fast, her tone sharper than before, but beneath it all lay something unmistakable: desperation. The defense attorney rose slowly, the contrast striking. His voice was calm, deliberate, each syllable chosen with care. "Your Honor, The child's recognition of this dog is not random. She did not confuse him with another animal. She pointed directly, immediately, with the clarity of familiarity. This is not something we can ignore. He turned to the jury, his gaze deliberate. If the canine was at their home before, then his so-called trail to the defendant's door may not be the unbroken line of truth the state claims. It may be coincidence, or worse, contamination. The jurors shifted uneasily. One woman chewed her lip. A man in the back scribbled something furiously on his notepad. Doubt, once a faint whisper, was now a growing voice in the room. The judge sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The court will allow this line of questioning to proceed, but we must proceed carefully. This is unusual territory, and just like that, the entire trial had pivoted. The toddler, blissfully unaware of the chaos she had caused, sat in the adjoining room with her mother, happily munching on a cracker pulled from the diaper bag. Her interruption had not been planned, not rehearsed, not manipulated. It was pure, unfiltered honesty, the kind only a child could provide. Back in the courtroom, attorneys prepared for the storm to come. The prosecutor shuffled papers with trembling hands, already recalculating strategies. The defense team whispered excitedly, sensing the fragile thread of hope growing stronger. The defendant sat taller now, no longer just a man under siege, but someone with a fighting chance. The K-9, still calm, rested at his handler's feet, unaware that the trust of 12 jurors and the fate of a man's life now teetered on the fin. Words of a toddler who had simply pointed and spoken the truth. For those in the gallery, it was a story unfolding unlike anything they had ever witnessed. People would later recall the exact moment the child spoke, the way gasps filled the air, the way the courtroom seemed to shiver under the weight of innocence colliding with justice. And though the trial was far from over, one thing had become clear. This was no longer just about evidence and testimony. It was about the power of an unexpected voice, small, unpolished, yet piercing enough to shake the very foundations of the case. The courtroom, once again in session after recess, no longer felt like the same room. What had been a stage for careful arguments and methodical testimonies had now transformed into a place buzzing with tension, speculation, and doubt. The toddler's words still lingered like an echo, impossible to dismiss. Though no official testimony had been given, her innocent declaration, "Doggy came to our house," was burned into the minds of everyone present. The defense attorney leaned forward at the table, his pen tapping lightly against a legal pad. For the first time since the trial began, his expression held not just determination, but a spark of confidence. His mind whirled with the possibilities. He knew the moment was fragile, the kind that could either collapse under scrutiny or reshape the entire case. And he was determined to make it the latter. The prosecution, on the other hand, radiated unease. The lead prosecutor's shoulders were taut, her voice just a little too sharp as she resumed her questioning of Officer Daniels. She tried to steer the narrative back to solid ground, emphasizing Coda's flawless training, his record of success, his reliability in countless other cases. But no matter how polished her words, the shadow of the toddler's interruption loomed. The jurors' expressions told the story. Trust had cracked, and once cracked, it was nearly impossible to repair. The judge, ever a figure of stern composure, glanced down at his notes before addressing the witness. "Officer Daniels, let me be clear. Has this K-9 been present at or near the home of the defendant prior to the night of the alleged burglary?" The question landed like a hammer. The courtroom went still. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged in this way. He prided himself on Coda's reputation, on their teamwork, on the countless nights where his dog's instincts had saved lives. But honesty was his duty, and he knew he could not lie under oath. "Yes, Your Honor," he admitted finally, his voice low but steady. Koda was in that neighborhood approximately 3 days prior to the reported burglary. He and I responded to a separate call, unrelated to this case. A wave of murmurs surged through the courtroom. The jurors' pens scratched furiously against their notepads. The defense attorney smiled faintly, just enough for his client to notice, not enough to look smug. The prosecutor's face flushed as she tried to contain the fallout. The judge raised a hand for silence. "And did you make note of this in your official report?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. It was included in the general incident log, but it was not considered relevant at the time." The defense attorney was on his feet instantly. "Not relevant, officer." Respectfully, if the canine had already been exposed to that environment, if he had already left his scent, his hair, his presence around the defendant's residence, how can this court accept his so-called tracking as clean, unbroken evidence? How can we say with certainty that he was not simply following familiar scents from a prior visit? The prosecutor objected, but her voice lacked its earlier steel. "Speculation, Your Honor. The child's statement is anecdotal at best, and the defense is stretching to undermine credible evidence." The judge overruled with a firm shake of his head. "Objection noted. But the defense raises a valid point. We will proceed." The jurors sat in silence, absorbing every word. And in their silence, doubt grew like a vine, creeping through the cracks of a foundation. The defense attorney, sensing the momentum, shifted his strategy. Instead of aggressive cross-examination, he leaned into logic, reason, and patience. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said later in his address, "I want you to consider this carefully. The prosecution asks you to trust the infallibility of a dog. And yes, dogs are remarkable creatures, loyal, intelligent, brave, but they are not perfect. They are living beings, influenced by scent, by memory, by prior exposure. If this canine was already familiar with the defendant's neighborhood, then his discovery, on the night in question, is not proof, it is coincidence. And coincidence does not equal guilt." The words were measured, deliberate, and they landed exactly where he wanted them to, in the spaces where jurors had already begun to question. The defendant, who had been slumped and defeated for so many days, now looked almost alive again. His eyes followed his attorney with renewed faith. His fingers, once clenched white-knuckled, now relaxed slightly against the table. For the first time, he dared to believe he might walk free. Meanwhile, the prosecution scrambled to rebuild its footing. The lead prosecutor emphasized the physical evidence again. Footprints near the scene, items found in the defendant's possession, witness accounts of someone matching his description in the area. But with each point raised, the defense countered with equal precision, weaving the narrative back to the fragility of the canine evidence. And always, in the back of everyone's minds, was the child's voice. Jurors remembered the way she had pointed without hesitation, the way her words carried the ring of innocent truth. She had no reason to lie, no motive to deceive. In many ways, her simple recognition carried more weight than the rehearsed testimonies of seasoned adults. Her honesty had peeled back the layers of the case, exposing a vulnerability no one had anticipated. During another recess, whispers filled the hallways outside the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically, calling their editors with updates. "The toddler just blew the case open," one said breathlessly. Spectators who had only planned to witness a routine trial now spoke as if they had front-row seats to history. Inside, the judge struggled to keep order. He reminded the jury repeatedly not to let emotion guide them, to focus on facts. But he knew as well as anyone that trials were as much about perception as evidence. And perception had shifted dramatically. By late afternoon, when the day's session came to a close, the atmosphere was electric. No verdict had been delivered, no decision made, but the balance of power had tilted. What once seemed a slam-dunk conviction now looked uncertain, fragile, even flawed. The child had not spoken again. She sat quietly in her mother's arms, tired from the long day, thumb tucked in her mouth. She did not know that her words had carried the weight of dynamite, blasting open a case built on shaky ground. She only knew she had seen the dog before, and in her world, that was worth saying out loud. As the courtroom emptied, the defense attorney paused by his client. "We're not finished," he said softly, "but today changed everything." The defendant nodded, swallowing hard, emotion tightening his throat. For once, hope felt real. The prosecutor, meanwhile, gathered her papers with stiff, clipped movements. She knew the battle ahead would be brutal. She had underestimated the fragility of her case, and now the smallest witness had done the greatest damage. And as the doors of the courtroom closed for the night, the story of the trial had changed forever. It was no longer about a burglary, or a man accused, or even the heroic reputation of a K-9. It was about the fragility of truth, and how sometimes it takes the smallest, most unlikely voice to reveal the cracks that everyone else had overlooked. The courtroom's tension had not faded overnight. If anything, it had thickened, wrapping itself around every corner of the chamber as the new day began. Reporters arrived earlier than usual. Jurors carried themselves with the stiffness of people who knew their task had grown heavier. And both sets of attorneys sat with papers spread before them, brows furrowed in concentration. At the center of it all was the judge, his face more severe than ever as he entered and took his seat at the bench. He had presided over trials for decades, had heard every manner of testimony and excuse, but what had unfolded yesterday was unlike anything he had seen before. A toddler's spontaneous declaration had shifted the trial in ways the law was ill-prepared to handle. He rapped his gavel once, calling the court to order. His voice was calm, but firm enough to command immediate silence. "Before we proceed with further testimony," he began, "this court must address a matter that has arisen, one which has the potential to affect the integrity of these proceedings. Specifically, the child's statement identifying the K-9 as having previously been at her home. This matter cannot be brushed aside, nor can it be treated as idle chatter. Therefore, the court will conduct a focused inquiry to determine whether the K-9's prior presence compromises the reliability of his tracking in this case." The words settled over the room like the slow drop of a curtain. It was official. What began as an innocent interruption was now a matter of legal record. The prosecutor shot to her feet, adjusting her jacket with sharp, deliberate motions. "Your Honor, with respect, we are setting a dangerous precedent by allowing the unverified words of a toddler to alter the course of this trial. Children at that age are highly impressionable and prone to imagination. To consider her recognition as credible is, frankly, irresponsible." The judge lifted a hand, silencing her mid-argument. "The court is not treating the child as a sworn witness," he clarified. "But the possibility raised of the K-9's prior exposure to the defendant's environment is material. That possibility must be examined. If the evidence is compromised, the jury has a right to know." The defense attorney rose smoothly, his voice measured but tinged with restrained triumph. "Your Honor, the defense commends the court for its diligence. We have long argued that the prosecution's reliance on the K-9 is flawed. Now, through no effort of our own, truth has surfaced. The defense formally requests an evidentiary hearing into the K-9's prior deployment in the defendant's neighborhood." The judge nodded once. "Granted. We will begin immediately." Gasps and murmurs rippled across the gallery. Spectators leaned forward, aware they were witnessing something rare. A judge stepping directly into the mechanics of a case, carving out space for clarity where uncertainty reigned. Officer Daniels was recalled to the stand. He looked weary, his eyes heavy as though he had not slept much. Coda lay at his feet, calm as always, unaware that his very presence now stood on trial alongside the defendant. "Officer Daniels," the judge began, "you testified yesterday that your K-9 was present in the defendant's neighborhood prior to the burglary in question. Provide this court with a detailed account." Daniels cleared his throat, his voice low but steady. "Yes, Your Honor. 3 days before the burglary, we responded to a disturbance call 3 blocks from the defendant's residence. Coda accompanied me, as he always does. During the call, the situation de-escalated quickly, but in the process, Coda and I did pass directly by the defendant's home. He may have detected scents or left his own trace during that time." The judge leaned forward. "And was this information communicated to the prosecution in advance of the trial?" Daniels hesitated. His eyes flickered briefly toward the prosecutor before returning to the bench. "No, Your Honor. It was logged as a routine patrol detail. I did not consider it relevant." The judge's expression darkened slightly, though his tone remained even. "You may not have considered it relevant, officer, but the defense and the jury might think otherwise. The integrity of evidence must be complete, not partial." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, moving with the deliberate pace of a man savoring the moment. "Officer Daniels, you say Coda may have detected scents during that prior visit. Would you agree that dogs, even trained dogs, can retain memory of smells they've previously encountered?" "Yes," Daniels admitted reluctantly. "Dogs have very strong olfactory memory, so it is possible. Mind you that when you conducted the scent trail leading to my client, Coda was following not a new scent from the burglary, but a scent already familiar from his prior visit." Daniels bristled. "It's possible, but unlikely. Coda is trained to distinguish." The defense attorney pressed, his voice never rising, only steady and insistent. "But not impossible. Which means the so-called certainty of the K-9's evidence is, in fact, uncertain." The jurors scribbled furiously. Some leaned forward, their faces tight with concentration. Doubt, once a whisper, now walked boldly among them. The prosecutor attempted to recover, redirecting the questioning to Coda's extensive record. She brought up his success rate, his commendations, the many times his work had led to convictions. She painted him as not just a dog, but an officer in his own right, loyal, dependable, consistent. But the more she spoke, the more it felt like a plea rather than a fact. The jurors listened politely, but their eyes betrayed what they were truly thinking. Past successes did not erase present doubts. Then the judge did something unexpected. He requested the incident log himself. A bailiff retrieved it, handing the worn binder to the bench. The judge scanned the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. Finally, he looked up. "It says here that Coda was not only in the neighborhood, but that he made direct contact with a child during that patrol," the judge read aloud. A hush fell over the courtroom. "Is this correct, Officer Daniels?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, Your Honor. A child came up to pet him. I allowed it briefly before moving on. It seemed harmless at the time." The courtroom erupted with murmurs. The toddler's words suddenly made even more sense. She hadn't just seen the dog, she had touched him. Of course, she remembered. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Order! Order in this court!" The prosecutor's face drained of color. The defense attorney could hardly disguise the satisfaction tugging at his mouth. The jury, meanwhile, looked electrified. What had once been speculation was now verified fact. The child's statement had been corroborated by official records. The judge leaned back in his chair, his voice grave. This court cannot ignore the possibility that the K-9's evidence was compromised. While this does not invalidate the entire case, it raises significant questions about the reliability of the prosecution's primary evidence. The jury will be instructed accordingly. The prosecutor's papers rattled as she tried to regroup. Without Coda's scent trail, her case was far weaker. The physical evidence could be explained. The eyewitnesses could be challenged, but the canine had been her anchor. And now, the anchor had snapped. As proceedings adjourned for the day, the gallery buzzed with excitement. Some whispered that the trial was already over, that the defendant would walk free. Others cautioned that the jury still had decisions to make. But all agreed on one thing. The judge's intervention had changed everything. In the quiet of the judge's chambers later that evening, he sat alone with the incident log before him. He rubbed his temples weary. He knew the law demanded impartiality, demanded that he weigh only facts and procedure. But in his heart, he marveled at the irony that the smallest voice in the room, untrained and unfiltered, had uncovered the truth that seasoned professionals had overlooked. Sometimes, he thought, justice didn't come from the gavel or the scales. Sometimes it came from the simple honesty of a child pointing at a dog. The trial had shifted dramatically since the judge's intervention. What began as a straightforward prosecution, built around the reputation of a decorated K-9 unit, had been shaken to its foundation by the smallest and most unexpected witness. Now, with the dog's prior presence confirmed and his contact with the toddler documented, the jury no longer sat with certainty. They sat with questions hard, uncheckable questions. On the morning of the 7th day, the defendant walked into the courtroom with shoulders straighter than before. The weight of accusation still clung to him, but hope had replaced despair. He glanced at his attorney, who gave the slightest nod of reassurance. It wasn't victory not yet, but the tide had turned. The gallery was packed tighter than ever. Word of the case had spread beyond the courthouse. Reporters scrambled for seats, camera crews waited outside, and spectators lined up before dawn just for the chance to watch. What had once been a quiet burglary trial had become a spectacle, because a toddler had pointed at a dog and spoken the truth no one expected. The defense attorney wasted no time capitalizing on the momentum. He stood, addressing the jury with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us review what we now know." The prosecution built its case upon the tracking ability of one dog. A dog who, we have learned, was in the defendant's neighborhood days before the alleged crime. A dog who interacted directly with the very child who recognized him in this courtroom. This is not speculation. This is fact, confirmed by the officer's own log. He let the words hang in the air, giving the jury time to absorb them. Now ask yourselves, how can we trust the evidence that followed? If the foundation is cracked, can the house stand? The jurors shifted uneasily. Several nodded faintly. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin, hard line. But the defense wasn't finished. "The state wants you to believe the dog's scent trail led unerringly to my client. But what if the dog was simply returning to a familiar scent, a scent he had encountered days before?" The law does not convict on guesses. It demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And what we have now is doubt clear, undeniable doubt. The prosecution rose sharply, objecting to the rhetoric, but the judge overruled with a curt wave of his hand. The defense was striking exactly where the cracks had widened. Still, the prosecutor wasn't about to surrender. She pivoted, focusing on what remained, the physical evidence. Items allegedly stolen were found in the defendant's possession. Neighbors had reported seeing someone of his build near the scene. These were not coincidences. She insisted they were patterns pointing directly to guilt. Her voice carried passion, but beneath it lay strain. She was no longer presenting from a position of strength. She was fighting uphill against the image of a child pointing with innocent certainty. The defense countered with equal fire. The stolen items? Second-hand goods, easily planted or mistaken. The eyewitnesses? Vague, uncertain, describing only a man of similar build. The prosecution's case was unraveling thread by thread, and the defense attorney pulled at each one with careful precision. Then came the moment that truly shifted the trial. The defense called the mother of the toddler to the stand, not the child herself, but the mother, who had been present during both the patrol encounter and the trial outburst. Nervously, she adjusted the microphone, her eyes flicking between the judge and the gallery. She hadn't wanted this. She was embarrassed that her daughter's spontaneous words had drawn so much attention. But she understood now that her role mattered. "Mrs. Jacobs," the defense began gently, "please tell the court what happened the day Officer Daniels and Coda came by your home." She nodded slowly. "It was 3 days before the burglary. I remember because it was the day my husband's car broke down. I was outside with my daughter when the officer and his dog passed by. My little girl loves animals, especially dogs. She ran up to pet him. The officer let her for a moment. She laughed, said he was soft. Then they left. I didn't think anything of it. And when your daughter saw the dog here in court?" The defense prompted. The mother swallowed. She recognized him right away. I could see it in her face. She wasn't guessing. She remembered him. The defense attorney's voice softened, yet carried to every corner of the room. "So when she said, 'Doggy came to our house,' she was telling the truth?" "Yes," the mother said firmly. She was telling the truth. A hush fell. The jury stared at her, then at the dog sitting quietly by his handler's side. The truth, simple and unvarnished, had been spoken again, this time not by a child, but by her mother, whose credibility no one could question. The prosecutor tried to shake her testimony, suggesting her daughter might have confused one dog for another, that memory in children was unreliable. But the mother did not falter. "You can believe what you want," she said, her voice steady. "But I know my child. And I know she remembered that dog." The defense rested its case soon after, confident it had planted doubt deep in the jury's mind. As the day closed, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters rushed to file stories with headlines like, "Mother confirms toddler's claim," "Canine evidence in jeopardy." The jurors left with serious, unreadable expressions. But one thing was clear. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. That evening, the defendant sat in his cell, replaying the day's events in his mind. For the first time in months, he felt the weight on his chest lighten. He whispered to himself in the dark, not as a prayer, but as a declaration. "They're starting to see the truth." The prosecutor, meanwhile, sat in her office long after sunset. The case file opened before her. She stared at the pages, willing them to offer clarity. But all she saw were holes she had failed to patch. A dog once seen as unshakable evidence now stood as the weakest link. And all because a toddler had pointed her finger and spoken without hesitation. In chambers, the judge prepared his instructions for the jury. His pen scratched across paper, careful and deliberate. He would remind them of their duty, to weigh evidence carefully, to separate emotion from fact. But even he knew, the case had taken a turn no one could ignore. The child's words had tilted the scales. By the time the courthouse lights dimmed, one truth had settled across every mind connected to the case. The trial no longer belonged solely to the lawyers, the judge, or even the evidence. It belonged to that fleeting, unforgettable moment when innocence pierced through procedure. And though the verdict was still to come, one fact had become undeniable. The toddler's recognition of the dog had changed everything. This was the turning point. The courtroom was silent. A kind of silence that presses on the chest, heavy and suffocating, as though the air itself refuses to move. It was the final day. The arguments had been made, the witnesses heard, the judge's instructions delivered. Now, everything hung on 12 ordinary citizens seated in the jury box. The defendant sat rigid, his hands clasped so tightly together, his knuckles were bone white. Beside him, his attorney leaned forward with calm on the surface, but fire burning in his eyes. Across the aisle, the prosecutor kept her gaze fixed on the table before her, jaw clenched, shoulders drawn tight. She had entered this trial confident, certain that the evidence would speak louder than any argument. But the trial had not gone as planned. A child's voice had cut through her case like lightning through a tree, leaving splintered pieces she had struggled to reassemble. The judge adjusted his glasses, peering down at the jury. His voice was steady, deep, and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with weary eyes, rose slowly. He held a slip of paper in his hand. The entire room leaned forward, breath collectively caught. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. His voice wavered just slightly. "Please deliver it to the bailiff." The bailiff took the folded slip, walking it to the bench. The judge unfolded it, scanning the words with an expression that betrayed nothing. Then he returned the paper to the bailiff, who handed it back to the foreman for reading aloud. "In the matter of the state versus Daniel Carter," the foreman began, his voice now steady, "we, the jury, find the defendant." The pause was unbearable. Even the old wall clock seemed to still itself, unwilling to intrude on this moment. "Not guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a wave of murmurs. The defendant sagged forward, his face buried in his hands, shoulders trembling with relief. His attorney placed a firm hand on his back, whispering, "It's over. You're free." The prosecutor closed her eyes for a brief second, her lips pressed together in resignation. She had fought hard, but she knew the truth. The case had been lost the moment the toddler pointed at the dog. From that instant, reasonable doubt had not just entered the room, it had taken root and refused to leave. The judge struck his gavel once. "Order. This court thanks the jury for its service. The defendant is hereby acquitted of all charges." Court is adjourned. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the chamber as jurors stood, some with relief, others with solemnity. They had carried a heavy burden, and now it was lifted. The gallery buzzed like a hive, reporters rushing out the doors to deliver breaking headlines. Toddler's words help acquit defendant. Canine evidence crumbles under innocent recognition. The defendant turned to his attorney, his eyes wet. "You saved my life." The attorney shook his head. "No, your daughter did." Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with questions. Microphones and cameras swarmed the steps, demanding answers from anyone connected to the case. The defense attorney gave a short statement, his words crisp and deliberate. Justice is not always found in the expected. Sometimes it takes the honesty of a child to reveal the flaws in what we assume is uncheckable. My client is innocent, and today that truth was recognized. The prosecutor slipped out a side exit, avoiding the frenzy. She would have to explain to her superiors how a case that once seemed airtight had unraveled so spectacularly. In her mind, she replayed the trial again and again, wondering if she could have countered differently, pressed harder, or found a way to silence the doubt. But deep down, she knew the truth. There had been no overcoming the child's words. The judge, in his chambers, removed his robe and sat heavily in his chair. He felt the weight of the day settle into his bones. He had seen countless trials in his career, but this one would linger in his memory forever. Not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. A toddler's recognition had changed everything. He shook his head slowly, marveling at the strange, unpredictable ways justice found its path. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the courthouse lobby, the mother cradled her daughter. The little girl was oblivious to the storm she had stirred. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit, humming softly, swinging her legs as if the world were nothing more than colors and sounds. "Sweetheart," her mother whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "you don't know what you did, but you helped Daddy today." The girl giggled, looking past her mother to where the canine sat with his handler across the room. She pointed again, smiling. "Doggy." Her mother's breath caught, But this time, there was no courtroom to silence, no jury to sway. Only the quiet truth of a child who remembered what she had seen. Officer Daniels stood nearby, one hand resting on Coda's head. For the first time in his career, he felt the sting of doubt in the system he had devoted his life to. Not in his dog Coda had done what he was trained to do, but in the way evidence could be misunderstood, misapplied, and over-relied upon. He looked across the room at the defendant, free now, and wondered how close the justice system had come to condemning an innocent man. As the courthouse emptied, the story spread far beyond its walls. It would be debated in law schools, written about in newspapers, dissected on television. Some would praise the outcome as a triumph of truth over procedure. Others would lament the fragility of cases built on imperfect evidence. But all would remember the moment when a toddler's finger pointed at a dog and changed the course of a trial. For the defendant, freedom was more than a verdict, it was a rebirth. That evening, he walked out of the courthouse into the fading sunlight, his daughter in his arms, his wife beside him. The world felt brighter, sharper, alive in a way it hadn't for months. The nightmare was over. He bent his head close to his daughter's ear. "Thank you, sweetheart," he whispered. She didn't understand, not really. She only hugged his neck and repeated her favorite word of the week, "Doggy." And for once, the word didn't bring chaos or fear. It brought laughter. It brought life. The case was closed, but its story would echo for years. How justice nearly faltered, and how it was rescued not by experts, not by evidence, not by legal maneuvers, but by the simple honesty of a child too young to know the weight of her words. Sometimes, the smallest voice speaks the loudest, and sometimes that voice rewrites everything.